Geeks and geekettes, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, comic book nerds of all varieties from around the world, welcome to Ask Chuck Dixon, where you get to ask me, a seasoned comic book professional, questions about what I do for a living. And what is it that I do for a living? I write comic books, as silly as that seems for a grown man. But I love it, because I've never grown up. Much like many of you, let's get to our first question. From Bretcher Rubini, who do you think did the best live action Punisher? I don't like any of them, to be quite frank with you. The Dolph Lundgren one was just, for me, an average 80s vigilante shoot 'em up flick. No relation really to the Marvel Universe at all, other than the fact that he called himself the Punisher. His name was Frank Castle. It's passable enough fare. But not really a true Punisher movie. Thomas Jane is probably my favorite Punisher, but I don't like the movie because they have him playing detective. And Frank Castle's not a detective. One thing I do like about it is they lift an entire scene that Johnny Romita Jr. and I did in Warzone, Punisher Warzone, and they lift it shot for shot, line for line. We should have gotten credit, and more importantly, money, for storyboarding and dialogue in that sequence. But that ain't never going to happen, is it? But I do like Jane's portrayal, but I don't like the movie. Ray Stevenson sadly passed away recently of unknown causes. Anyway, I won't get into that. He did a good job, but again, I don't like this movie. It's a lot of shoot 'em up. It's probably closest to a Punisher movie that we're ever going to get because it follows the standard Punisher formula that we all know and love, where Frank just makes more and more and more problems for himself until the only way out of them is killing everybody in the room, or the building as occurs in this movie. Good effort, but boy, there's some painful dialogue in this and some painfully set up scenes and a whole bunch of ancillary characters we really didn't need. Although there's a great Punisher moment at the dining room table. You all know what I'm talking about. That's Frank Castle. If you saw the movie, you're not going to forget that scene. John Bernthal, I think, is great casting. His Punisher is a bit weepy. For me, is a bit too much emphasis on his origin, which is a problem I have with almost every comic book related project out there. They keep going back to the origin, going back to his motives. Who cares? Let's create a great crime story and put Frank Castle in it. Stop making it about Frank Castle and put him in good stories. You never see a Die Hard movie that's just about John McClane and his divorce proceedings. Because who wants to see that? And I don't want to see any of that stuff with Frank Castle. I just want to see him taking care of business. And speaking of taking care of business, the problem I have with almost every iteration of the Punisher on film and television, except one, is he doesn't deal with quality of life crimes. Now, Punisher is an adult wish fulfillment figure as opposed to a childhood wish fulfillment figure, as most superheroes are. Frank Castle, is the guy as an adult that we wish we could be when they start giving us crap at the bank, or our drive-through order is delayed because the person in front of us can't make up their mind. And you kind of want to be a guy like Frank Castle, just taking care of business kind of guy. The other thing is that the vigilante justice genre doesn't grow out of our frustration that the mafia or the cartels or the Russian mob isn't being punished enough. It grows out of our frustration with quality of life crimes, street crimes. It grows out of this wish that someone would freaking clean up the streets so you could walk your dog at night without thinking you're going to get stabbed or shot or run over by a drunk driver. And those are the kind of crimes that I always made sure I put in Punisher. Even though he was dealing with grandeur, fighting big mobs, fighting the underworld, he was also cleaning the streets. He was also taking care of the kind of crooks and thugs that you or I might run into at any time, filling up our car at the gas station or, taking the kids to the mall. You might run into creeps like this. And Frank takes care of them. And that's the wish fulfillment, true wish fulfillment of the Punisher, is that in an everyday situation, you wish you could be Frank Castle. And all of these needed more of that, except the kind of fan-made Thomas Jane short called Dirty Laundry, which is very much about quality of life crimes. I want to see a whole movie like that, where Frank is just, cleaning up the streets, doing the work that the police can't do. Hey, we got a twin spin. And there's Brett's puppies. Okay, have you ever watched Captain America Winter Soldier? This is turning into Chuck. Have you ever seen this? Have you ever seen that? If so, what did you think of it? I get the feeling, and we'll see this later in the video, that a lot of times you're thinking, I'm going to ask Chuck about this, and I really hope he likes it. I hope he likes what I liked. Or I'm going to be disappointed. Or maybe you don't like this and you want me to trash it. Either way, I really think this movie is where the Marvel Universe began to go wrong. You kind of lose the plot thread. I understand the whole Winter Soldier thing and Cap being weepy about Bucky and then Bucky still being alive and all that other stuff. Yeah, that's good grist for like the emotional backstory of the movie, but not enough to carry the whole film. I've never been in love with this idea that Bucky was still alive and and still the same age as Cap and turned into like this deadly assassin. It all gets pretty murky and dark. And really, this is where, for me, the Marvel Universe goes wrong. I know a lot of people like this because the action's great. There's some really terrific action set pieces and everything else. But the scene with Nick Fury with the Gatling gun in the back of his truck, that's cool. So there's a lot of good stuff in it, but it's a lot of sound and fury, signifying nothing. And I really, really hate the idea that S.H.I.E.L.D. was infiltrated to the point where 50% of its agents were with Hydra. I don't buy. We were supposed to think that S.H.I.E.L.D. is like the coolest spy organization, real badass, they directly deal with problems. They got their finger on the pulse. They're allied with Tony Stark, like the smartest guy in the world. So they would have all kinds of ways to vet people that wanted to join S.H.I.E.L.D. And yet Hydra infiltrated to a point where every other S.H.I.E.L.D. agent is actually a double agent. And that really bothered me. And then they destroy S.H.I.E.L.D. headquarters because, that's great eye candy and everything else. But it kind of reminded me of all the times that they've crashed the Enterprise in Star Trek. It's like every other movie in the Star Trek franchise destroys the Enterprise. So it has to be rebuilt before the next movie. And it's like, yeah, I don't know. For me, the wheels came off here. You began to see the seams. You began to see the idea that they weren't concerned about plot. They weren't concerned about making these movies memorable. They just wanted a big opening weekend with lots of splashy CGI effects, and they were happy with that. They really weren't concerned about where they were going with all of this, obviously. Gentle Savage, Mr. Dixon, have you ever encountered anybody you never expected to be a fan of your work, let alone have any interest in comics? Yeah, I did a store appearance here in Florida, down near MacDill Air Force Base. And MacDill Air Force Base is the home to CENTCOM. And CENTCOM is where the War on Terror was run from, or probably is still run from. And I did an appearance down there, and no surprise, a lot of service guys dig comic books. And a lot of service guys dig G.I. Joe. And I was on G.I. Joe at the time. And a number of them came, so I wasn't surprised at that. But one of the guys came, talked to me for a long time, and then he left, and then came back, and he gave me a mug, and it was from his special operations group, who do planning for like hunter-killer teams and stuff like that. So I found out this guy was like one of the head honchos of the hunter-killer teams hunting down bad guys all over the world in 100 countries at once. And that surprised me, that someone that high level. And that guy told me, he said, there isn't an office at CENTCOM where there isn't some G.I. Joe something, an action figure, a poster, something. He says, we all dig America's hero, G.I. Joe. Another one that came as a surprise was Matthew Sweet wrote a song about Evangeline, one of the first professional comic jobs I had. And apparently was a fan of the series, and it's not a coincidence because he mentions ancillary characters and situations and everything else. So he definitely wrote the song about Evangeline. So that came as quite a surprise. Other times I've had pro wrestlers who are big fans. I was out to dinner with a bunch of comic pros, and a guy came up, big guy comes up, tells me how much he loves Nightwing. He's real enthusiastic. I said, well, thank you for the kind words. He goes back to his table, and everybody at the table staring at me. And I'm like, what? And, don't you know who that was? I'm like, no, I don't. Who was he? He's this huge pro wrestling guy that I didn't know, because I don't follow that area. Not to put it down, I met a lot. I live in Tampa. I meet wrestlers all the time at store appearances at conventions. This is like where they come to retire. And I've even flown first class sitting next to Hulk Hogan. So it's hard to move around Tampa without bumping into a former pro wrestler. Okay, Joseph Arnold. How many other amazing palindromes did you have prepped for Torque and Nightwing? Seems like a very difficult motif, and nobody ever really followed up. I remember to this day, rats at a bar, grab at a star. Now, if you don't know what a palindrome is, it's a word or sentence that reads the same forwards as backwards. And yes, I had several books filled with palindromes. And I don't know how long I could have kept this going. The gag is Torque was Dudley Soames. He was a detective, an inspector, actually, in the city of Bloodhaven during my Nightwing run. And he gave Nightwing all kinds of trouble. And finally, Blockbuster got tired of this guy and thought he had killed him. He broke his neck by turning his head backwards. But miraculously, Dudley Soames lived with his head on backwards and became he's wearing mirrored glasses here, if you're not familiar with the character. And he became Torque because his neck had been torqued. Clever, huh? And his gimmick was, since he was backwards, he was going to deal in palindromes, much like the Riddler deals in riddles. And I had books of them. But wedding the story to the palindromes was getting tougher and tougher. I can see why no one followed up on it. It's quite a high bar to set to have these backward and forward words and phrases sprinkled throughout his dialogue and as plot points. But it was fun. It was fun. And collecting them, I've got this huge collection of palindromes, but I never got to use them all. N. Furman. I attached the latest webisode of myself and Roy Thomas's Tarzan of the Apes adaptation, which I have been getting some supposed racist FB Facebook accusations for drawing it. How do you feel about not being able to incorporate villains if they're minorities? I call BS on that. Talk about the soft bigotry of low expectations. So all people of certain minorities are good, and then all people of other minorities are suspect. Seems to be a notion that the media is pushing on us pretty hard, media and corporations, that if you're white, we got to keep an eye on you, buddy. But everybody from minority, every illegal immigrant crossing the border, and they're all just wonderful, fabulous, amazing people. Well, I happen to believe that there's probably the same percentage of a-holes and losers amongst every minority as there is amongst Caucasians. I think a-holes and losers are equally sprinkled throughout our population, irregardless of race, class, ethnicity, or religious belief. I think that they are a part of our lives, no matter what your skin color or what God you worship. you're going to run into jerks. You're going to run into bad people. And to sort of make all the all the bad guys white, because that's easier, because you won't get flack, that's crap, man. That is seriously crap. Remember in the 80s and 90s when they would have these street gangs, these integrated street gangs, urban street gangs, where they'd have the red-haired white guy and the dude with the mohawk, and maybe a Hispanic-looking guy, and always an Asian guy, and he always had butterfly knives. Like, that's not racist. As if it was like a Colors of Benetton selection process in choosing gang members. And if you're like me and everybody else on the planet, you looked at it and you're like, wow, I'm taken right out of the movie right now, because that's not who I would run into in a dark alley. I would not run into this cast of characters, because there was no polyglot mixed neighborhood anywhere in the city except maybe Midtown, which generally Midtown of any town doesn't generate gang members. It's always poorer areas. But whatever. You got to go where you got to go. If you're dealing, Tarzan runs into a lot. He's in Africa, for God's sakes. He's going to run into bad black people. And if you look at Africa today, there's a lot of examples of that. African nations are, an awful lot of them live under oppression from their own people. They're not, there's no more colonies. There's no more colonists. These countries are left to their own devices and generally abused by people with the same skin color as themselves. And they're not good guys. That isn't to say that their whole population is bad or corrupt or evil. Probably it isn't. It isn't. They're just normal people living their lives, but they're being abused by their own kind. And that's the history of mankind. And nothing's going to change that. So my philosophy, when I hear this kind of stuff, is the dogs bark, but the caravan moves on. You owe nothing as a creator. You or Roy Thomas owe nothing as a creator to anybody except what you're doing, your story, the story you're trying to tell. And you tell the story that you want to tell and let the chips fall where they may. Now, you're probably hearing this, I bet you they're not going after Roy. They're going to go after you because they think you're the low man on the totem pole. They hardly ever come after. I'm not inviting them to come after me, but they hardly ever come after me anymore because I ignore them. And it's a waste of time to tisk me over my story choices, because I just don't care. Okay. And it's just unfair. And it's at the bottom of it all. It's always the racist who's calling you a racist. Isn't that true? All right. David Jordan, I've heard you say that because of fan hatred toward Asbat actually affecting sales, the Bat writers had to bring Bruce Wayne back sooner than planned. My question is, how much longer did you guys originally plan to have John Paul Valley as Batman? Are there any plans for Asbat that you had planned but abandoned when the Return to Batman got moved up? Yeah, he wasn't popular. It was going to go on for another 6 months. Denny at the beginning said, we really want to try to convince the readers this is a permanent change, because the gag doesn't work unless we really make them believe it. We stick with this through thick and thin. Bruce Wayne not coming back for a year or more. And sales plummeted because they didn't like this guy. I mean, we didn't want them to like this guy, but we thought they would have enough interest in the story to keep coming back, even though they didn't like the guy, but they didn't like the guy. So that was, the end of that. And we had to have a hurry up summit and plan Prodigal. Because I think the original plan was to bring Bruce Wayne back after a year and a half, after a reasonable amount of time for his back to heal, unlike Dark Knight Rises, where it took like 36 hours. So a reasonable amount of time for his back to heal and him to be back to 100%. And I think we did Prodigal because it made more sense logistically. Okay. Also, it was the question we kept getting asked. Why did he choose John Paul Valley of all people? Why didn't he choose Dick Grayson to stand in for him? And so we dealt with all of that in Prodigal, which, was the next arc. Now, as to did we all have to change our plans? No, we didn't have to change any plans because Doug, Alan, and I, we weren't making the stories about Asbats. We were just making, Batman action, mystery, adventure stories with Asbats in place of Bruce Wayne. So there was really nothing to change. We just used those same stories, except now it was going to be Dick Grayson as Batman facing those same villains and challenges. Because Doug and Alan and myself, we aren't the kind of guys who write stories about the main character. We write stories with the main character in them. Big difference there. So yeah, no real changes to anything, except we were all relieved to see to see Asbats going. Because, and the artists in particular, I mean, Graham, I know, was frustrated. I finally get on a Batman title, and it's not the real Batman. And they were tired of drawing that costume. And so, yeah, it was good to be back to our standard form, even though, it was Dick Grayson, because Dick Grayson put on the traditional Batman outfit and was the perfect stand-in for Bruce Wayne. So we didn't have to write about this tedious, pretentious psycho anymore. Ophi, have you ever done any Conan crossovers, something like Tarzan versus Conan? Are there Conan crossovers? Yeah, I mean, he was in the Avengers, what was the Savage Avengers for a while, which I don't know, I can't confirm this, but I think this is what made the people that own the Howard stuff take it back. I think they thought that they were using Conan in a way that he was not meant to be used. I'm not aware, and I think I'm bolstered in that is I can't recall any other Conan crossovers. Now in the comments below, he crossed over with this character and that character. But I'm not aware. I'm not aware that Conan ever crossed over with anybody, which makes me believe that the holders of the rights to Conan resisted crossovers, that they didn't like the idea of crossovers and so didn't do it. And there are license holders who do not like mixing and matching their characters with other characters. And so there aren't any. Now, would I write one? Yeah, I'm a crossover whore. I'd write one in an instant. Conan versus aliens? Sign me up. I think they'd be a perfect fit for a Conan story. I mean, they're monsters right out of Lovecraft and Howard. So, yeah, I would do that in a minute. But I haven't seen anybody do that. Speaking of Conan, just a brief little word that I do have a Conan novel out there. If you want to pick it up on Amazon or at Arkhaven or at Barnes & Noble, it's getting good reviews. It's selling pretty briskly. Everybody seems pretty happy with it. I've written the second one. I'm halfway through the third. This is at the end of the broadcast. I'm just throwing this in because Conan came up. So check it out. Joshua Ignatowski, when coming up with casts of characters for series you worked on, how did you come up with groups of characters whose personalities played off each other well? Well, I mean, when you write a story, a Western, a police procedural, a historical romance, you got to populate it with characters. And, you need, to my mind, you need certain character types to make the story work. Characters that conflict as much as cooperate, to keep it interesting, to keep a dynamic there. Everybody's not all best friends all the time and they all agree with each other 100% of the time. They're not fighting all the time, but maybe there's a little group tension, jealousy, envy. Now, when I say you need to fill certain roles in a story, I'm not talking Joseph Campbell crap, where you go, well, you need the Joker and you need the princess and you need you need these archetypes. No, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about, you need a comedy relief character. You need, if your hero's a loner, you need somebody for him to talk to. He's got to have somebody to talk to. Saw the movie Taxi Driver. He would talk to the character Wizard, played by Peter Boyle. So he was talking to someone outside of the voices in his own head. So that's why Punisher has Micro, Batman has Alfred, and eventually Robin. Superman visits Kandor every once in a while, so he can talk to his own people, kind of people. Catch up on his Kryptonian. So you need characters to talk to. Also, in my mind, you need either a comedy relief character or a character who, when combined with the hero, creates some humor. because of maybe differences they have, or the past they have, or maybe they're just funny together, even if they don't think they are. You need the romantic interest, and then all the ancillary characters they run into. I mean, a lot of these books. I mean, I always give in my Conan novels, and a lot of times when I was writing Conan comics, I gave him a sidekick who was either comedy relief or a tough guy, or a Tonto type character, a guy he could rely on to have his back, a potential victim, so and someone for Conan to talk to. So because you just don't want to write exposition captions all the time. You want to have the characters talking about their situation in quote unquote real time in the comic. So every story demands a different cast of characters that you want to introduce. And of course, a lot of your ancillary characters are going to have arcs of their own. Maybe they are the betrayer inside of the group, or maybe they are a hostage, a victim, a further motivator for the character. So it kind of it depends on the demands of the story, what kind of characters that you introduce, and then it's up to you what they're like, what they look like, sound like, what their voice is, what is it they want, why are they there, and things like that to keep them interesting and distinct. It's very, very important in an ensemble book that everybody be distinct. That even if the panel were black and you just had word balloons, you know who's talking. Very, very important. Also distinct, if you see them all in silhouette, you still know who they are. So little pointers there. Another one from Joshua Ignatowski. Might you be able to list for us what the different types of Westerns are and what different attributes make them unique from one another? Well, this is my own categorization of the different kinds of Westerns based on Westerns that I like. You got the old school Saturday matinee, singing cowboy, action feature. They're generally about 70 minutes long. They made tons of them. Hollywood cranked out tons of them. And some of them are still pretty entertaining. The Roy Rogers movies stand up today. There's a number of others that are still good, still a lot of fun to watch. But there are tons of them available on DVD. I don't know if anybody streams these things. They should. And they're, nice little, hour or more diversion of shooting and fighting and singing and horse riding and all that stuff. So that to me is like, this was the Western that was created basically for audiences of children. And then the Western became more adult. Then you have the outdoors adventure Western, the action against the sky Western, like, The Searchers or any of the Jimmy Stewart or Randolph Scott Westerns. These are all Westerns that take place primarily outdoors. Randolph Scott movies, especially his later ones, are amazing because there's no interiors. They take place entirely outdoors, which you really don't think about until you've watched them a number of times. You go, wow, they never go in a building. They're always outside. I guess that was cheaper because Scott kept those budgets lean and earned a ton of money off them. So the Western adventure can be anything. It can be a wagon train movie or a Indian fighting movie or anything like that. Then you have the town Western, which primarily this is a shot from Warlock. Awesome town Western, which is generally like a Tombstone kind of thing. It's about different factions within a Western town, conflicts and suspense, and everything leading to a violent confrontation at the end, a shootout in town. There's a million, High Noon famously, Warlock, more recently Open Range and Tombstone. These are town Westerns, generally set in a smaller environment. And they're town tamer stories. Who's going to run the town? The gamblers or the sheriff? Fistful of Dollars is essentially a town Western. Then there's the cavalry Western, which they stopped making a long time ago. And it's basically a military war type movie, war against the Apaches or the Sioux or the Comanches, and shows the cavalry, and they're always at a desolate outpost, and things are usually grim. They're usually outnumbered. And John Wayne made a bunch of these, and they made them all the way through into the 60s when they sort of fell out of favor. The last one I can remember, I'm not going to count Hostiles because I don't know what the hell that was. The last one I can remember is Elzana's Raid in the 70s, the last good cavalry Western with Burt Lancaster. But yeah, that's another solid genre with a lot of entries. And then, of course, the Italian Westerns. The Italian Westerns could be anything from revenge to comedies to outdoor adventure. I don't think they ever did cavalry. That wouldn't have gone over very big in Europe. And what can I say? They were the Italian Westerns. They made over 700 of them inside of 15 years, and they're of varying quality. They're always interesting, always a little bit strange, but I love them. I love Italian Westerns, and they're generally nasty and venal. There's no real good guys in Italian Western. Then there's the comedy Western, Destiny Rides Again, Cat Ballou, leading to the parody Westerns like Blazing Saddles. And this was a whole genre to itself and popular for quite a while. There were comedy Western television series. And because the Western is such a beloved and established genre, it was inevitable that people would begin poking fun at it. I prefer this kind of comedy Western, which was, The Destiny Rides Again is an amazing movie. It's just a seamless Western. It's also a very funny comedy. It's got a great plot line, terrific characters throughout, and it's got a lot of heart. It's got a lot of heart and a solid plot line. So it's generally a town Western, but it's primarily a comedy Western. And Jimmy Stewart and Marlene Dietrich are freaking amazing in this movie. They are just amazing. As is the whole cast. The whole cast is incredible. Then you have the 1970s, what I call the mean Western. The American filmmakers began to look at the Italian Western receipts, and see, wow, these things make a lot of money overseas. Let's get into this. Let's make those kind of Westerns. But of course, the mean Westerns made by generally UK or American production companies weren't quite like the Italian Westerns. They were more authentic, closer to traditional Westerns. What they did have in common was the hero was generally an anti-hero. He was usually a son of a bitch, and the violence was really vivid, really visceral. I'm thinking of movies like Chado's Land, Valdez is Coming, Lawman, especially The Hunting Party. That's a very mean Western. Elzana's Raid, which I mentioned earlier. There's any number of these which are worth seeing. But I really think they deserve a genre of their own. So that's how I categorize. That's how I break down the different Western movies. First name, last name. If I recall correctly, you said that since moving to Florida, it's seldom taken you long to drive anywhere. This very notion is quite alien to me, as I lived in the Central Florida area for several years. The traffic on I-4 was such a crawl that it often took at least 30 to 40 minutes to get somewhere. So my question is, what in all of OA is your secret for such a remarkable fast travel times? Well, I know all the back roads, and I never get on I-4. Oh my God. Now that said, I don't know when you saw me say that it was easy to get around, but it ain't that easy anymore. I moved to Central Florida, and now 20 years later, I'm living on Long Island, if you know what I mean. I mean, it looks just like Long Island, and there's retail stores everywhere. There's shopping centers everywhere. The streets are packed. When I moved into the place where I live now, the highway or the road that I pull off to go into my development was a dirt road, 2-lane dirt road. Now it's a 6-lane highway with another 6-lane highway crossing it. So I tend to stay off I-75 and I-4. I like Veterans Expressway because it's a toll road, which means it's privately owned and privately maintained, which means it's an awesome highway. The government is not involved at all. Now, I-4, if you've never been to Florida, the problem with Florida is there's only 3 east-west routes across the whole state. That's a long state. It's a very long state. But there's only Alligator Alley, I-4, which goes to Orlando, which is a nightmare, or you got Route 10 all the way at the top of the state. So if you want to go from the Gulf to the Atlantic, you've only got 3 ways to choose, and they're all bad. Alligator Alley is at least colorful and generally moves pretty quickly. I've never seen traffic on Alligator Alley. I-4, on the other hand, I have friends that say, well, I'm coming to Orlando. Why don't you come over and have dinner with me? This is because it can take anywhere from 90 minutes to 5 hours to get there because of the traffic. And if I go back roads and everything else, eventually I got to end up on I-4. There's no way to go to Orlando without getting on I-4, no matter how much of it you cut off. I'll give you an example. I went to the last MegaCon I went to. It took me an hour and a half to get to the exit to the MegaCon. It took me another hour and a half to get from the exit to the parking outside the convention center. So I never go to Orlando. It's nuts. It's completely nuts. They should have put an Autobahn across the state, and we really do need another east. I'm getting into Florida politics. We really do need another east-west corridor or 2 across the state. Hey, if you want to get a hold of me and talk about traffic, it's like an early 1970s AM talk show. That traffic is terrible. I can't even drive on the Schuylkill Expressway anymore. Anyway, if you want to get a hold of me and tell me to shut up, get a hold of me at brunobookstore@gmail.com, brunobookstore@gmail.com. I check it all the time. I check it obsessively. This is the most direct way. You can ask questions in the comments. You can ask questions on Facebook. You can DM me on Twitter or whatever, but I might miss them. I'm never going to miss a question you send to brunobookstore@gmail.com. And if you send me a question at brunobookstore@gmail.com and I never answer, it means I just never had anything to say. I'm not ignoring you. I just never had anything to say. While I got you, Joe Frankenstein. Joe Frankenstein Part 2 is on Indiegogo right now. It's a 30-day campaign. I think we're over a week into it. It's the second part of Graham Nolan and my amazing Joe Frankenstein, our tribute to the classic Universal horror films, action adventure. And you got to get this. If you're following the Nolanverse, the terrific shared horror universe that Graham Nolan is creating, if you're following that Nolanverse and you haven't read Joe Frankenstein, you need to read Joe Frankenstein before Ghosts of Matacumba Key comes out. Ghosts of Matacumba Key is where it all gets pulled together. And trust me, you're going to want to read Joe Frankenstein because for the full impact of the final pages of Ghost of Matacumba Key, where you're going to go, whoa, that's cool. Because Graham's he's been working hard for a number of years. His Machiavellian plans to draw you into this whole reality that he's creating right out of his own head. And so go to Indiegogo and support that, and you'll be happy. And Graham's already fulfilling part 1. That's already gone out to people. A lot of people already have it in their hands. So it's a deal, man. And he'll have this one in your hands probably sooner than later. This one will be in your hands before Ghost of Matacumba Key comes out, well before. So that's it for me. I want to thank you for watching and listening and liking and subscribing and all the rest of it. And I'll see all of you down the road.